Thanks.
Order breakfast at the McDonald's drive-thru. Tell yourself you'll wait to eat it at work, but it smells way too good. So you eat it right there in the McDonald's parking lot meal. There's a meal for every morning at McDonald's.
Right now, get any size iced coffee for 99 cents until 11 a.m. and pair it with your favorite breakfast sandwich or one of our tasty bakery treats. Price and participation may vary.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. McDonald's. I'm loving it.
This governor's race will help confirm whether Virginia still is a swing state or whether it's become kind of more of a safely Democratic state.
On this episode of Transition Virginia,
nobody's going to be signing pledges in the future.
The 2021 Democratic Primary.
Regionalism is not as important as it used to be.
There's a kind of a fancy political science term for this called thermostatic public opinion.
We're joined by the Dean of the Schar School, Mark Rozell.
Both parties actually got their more ideological type candidate in the lieutenant governor nomination.
And Kyle Kondik at the Center for Politics.
The presidential party often loses the Virginia governorship, although one modern exception, of course, is that Terry McAuliffe himself bucked that trend in 2013.
Election returns from the top of the ticket to the bottom.
Glenn Youngkin made overtures to the Trump wing of the Republican Party in order to get the nomination, and Terry McAuliffe will never let that be forgotten.
This time, it's the Republicans who are going to be trying to localize, and Democrats are the ones trying to nationalize.
It's a big repudiation of the anti-establishment coalition.
On this episode of Transition Virginia.
I think what flavor of these new Dunkin' coconut refreshers you get says a lot about you.
Really? What's it say about me?
Well, you got the refreshing golden peach because you're vibrant, fun, and positive.
Oh, what about me?
The bold purple pomegranate means you're vibrant, fun, and positive.
I take it I got this delicious pink strawberry because I'm vibrant, fun, and positive.
Yeah, it's a simple system, really.
Share the shine. Enjoy a medium Dunkin' coconut refresher for $3. Order ahead plus earn rewards. America runs on Dunkin'. Participation may vary. Limited time offer. Excludes classic Dunkin' refreshers.
Welcome to Transition Virginia, the podcast that examines the ongoing transition of power in Virginia. I'm Michael Pope.
And I'm Thomas Bowman. Today on the podcast, the Democratic Primary. What does the election say about the direction of the party, and what does it mean for the fall campaign season?
And we have a dynamite panel here to walk us through the election results and explain what we can learn from the numbers. We're joined by the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, Mark Rozell. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by the managing editor of Sabados Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia's Center for Politics, Kyle Kondik. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The primary is finally over. We've got the election results. What is our top line takeaway? Mark Rozell, let's start with you.
Well, the top line takeaway is pretty much as expected. The results, Terry McAuliffe nominated for governor and Mark Herring renominated for attorney general. And then the candidate who had largely the leading endorsements, Ayala, ends up the nominee as lieutenant governor. So Terry McAuliffe winning by over 60% of the vote, winning every single county and city in the state. That was a hugely impressive achievement by him at a time when many were saying it's maybe time to move on and have a different face for the Democratic Party. The Democrats voting at the grassroots decided to go with a known quantity, a former governor, and to reward experience in this particular case, I think, more than the idea of change.
Kyle Kondik, what did we learn from this primary?
I think that the Virginia Democratic electorate is, I guess, maybe a little risk averse in that I think this is the second straight Democratic gubernatorial primary where, 4 years ago, the voters picked Ralph Northam over Tom Perriello, who I think was kind of more of an insurgent candidate, ran to Northam's left in some ways, although on certain cultural issues, Northam was able to get to Perriello's left. But then 4 years later, faced with, I guess, a somewhat similar choice, although with a much more fractured field, Democratic primary voters decided to again go with a safer choice, a more proven commodity. Northam, of course, was the sitting lieutenant governor when he got nominated 4 years ago. And McAuliffe is a former governor, and incumbents can't run again in Virginia. But McAuliffe's about the closest thing you could get to an incumbent in a gubernatorial race, given that he just held the job himself 4 years ago. There was a lot of talk about turnout, whether it was good or bad or whatever for Democrats. In terms of raw numbers, it was not as large as the kind of blockbuster 2017 turnout, in which it was about 540,000 Democrats voted in that Northam versus Perriello primary. Looks like total turnout is going to be about 485,000, which is still on the higher side historically in Virginia. And I think that I think that there were some Democrats who were worried that it would be significantly lower than that. So I think it shows that there's still a level of engagement that maybe wasn't present prior to Donald Trump winning in 2016, although the white-hot intensity probably isn't burning quite as hot as it was 4 years ago. And, of course, part of how Glenn Youngkin could try to win this governor's race is make sure that his side is more motivated than the Democrats are. We'll see how that comes to pass. And, of course, Youngkin won his nomination in a kind of a hybrid convention. And so you can't really compare the turnout in a convention to a primary.
Yeah, what's interesting about the results with Terry McAuliffe getting over 60%, it's a big repudiation of the anti-establishment coalition that had been starting to form in the Democratic Party. I'd said in previous podcasts that the best progressives typically get to do in Virginia is around 30%. And if you add up everybody who's not Terry McAuliffe, it's a little bit over 30%. And so past is prologue often in these elections. And so one thing that I learned is don't run statewide when you're not ready.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, sometimes I feel like, fortune favors the bold in some of these races, that maybe you should jump in when you have a chance. But the problem for the non-McAuliffe candidates is that there simply were too many of them, and none of them were ever able to kind of outshine the others necessarily and to make a clear case against McAuliffe.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think if the Democratic left wanted to challenge the old guard and wanted to point the Virginia Democratic Party into the future in a different direction, they needed to unify behind one of those four candidates who were running to the left of Terry McAuliffe. And of course, candidates, their egos being what they are, every single one looks in the mirror and thinks, I can be the next governor. It's hard to get any of them to step back for what others might consider the greater good of the cause, to try to unify around one person who can put up a viable challenge against the presumed frontrunner. So you had four more liberal candidates running in this campaign, splitting up the progressive vote, which made it really likely all along. And I there was no surprise that Terry McAuliffe was going to be able to easily win in the primary.
Kyle, you were talking about the turnout a second ago. So the turnout this year was higher than in 2009, but lower than in 2017. Beyond that, you have to go all the way back to 1977 to compare the turnout. And, back then it was a totally different era. You had 24% of voters voting in that 1977 Democratic primary, a time when Democrats lost the primary, even with that huge turnout. So, I mean, that's kind of the ancient past. But if you think about modern elections, in 2009, there was like a 6% turnout. And that's a year that Democrats lost to Bob McDonnell. So, I mean, that's not a particularly good sign. And, in 2017, the turnout was around 10%. And that's a year Democrats won with Ralph Northam. So, I mean, the fact that it's below the, winning year with Ralph Northam, but above the sort of losing year with McDonnell, I mean, doesn't that indicate that this level of turnout might in fact indicate some kind of lack of enthusiasm or problem for the Democrats?
Look, I mean, it certainly could. I mean, look, I think a party, in a primary setting probably wants as many people to participate as possible, just as sort of a sign of enthusiasm. Of course, in Virginia, it changes year to year whether parties decide to have a primary or a convention or whatnot. And, the Republicans decided to have to have a convention. And in a normal convention, you'd have all the delegates gather in a single location and cast ballots and actually have several rounds of voting. This time, because of the pandemic, Republicans held what was called an unassembled convention, which essentially meant that You had delegates meeting at casting ranked choice ballots at about 40 locations across the state. About 30,000 votes were cast in the first round of voting. If we had actually had a primary on the Republican side, and I think the Republican primary turnout in 2017 was something like 365,000 or so. If the Republican primary turnout had been like 450 and the Democrats had only been 485, I think you could look at that and say, oh, well, Republicans are sort of catching up in terms of enthusiasm, but we don't actually have that data point. And, you mentioned the 1977 Democratic primary, which was the previous record holder for Democratic primary turnout in a gubernatorial race in Virginia. That was Henry Howell, who was a progressive liberal firebrand, against Andy Miller, the kind of conservative Democratic attorney general. Howell won the primary, but then got blown out in the general election. And so it wasn't that high turnout was necessarily predictive of anything. And I don't know if there's great research that suggests that high primary turnout is all that meaningful. You could look at 2017 and say that it was. And maybe if the Democrats lose the governorship this time in 2021, we'll see a Democratic base that maybe was less engaged. But I don't think it was bad turnout. I mean, it was less than 2017, but 2017 was really pretty high.
So I get your point that there's not necessarily data that shows that's a problem, but I will say Democrats are uneasy about what they view as a low turnout and potentially lack of enthusiasm. Mark Rozell, do you think that might be a problem for Democrats heading into the fall election season?
Right. It's a potential problem. Kyle is right. Clearly, there are occasions where high turnout does not correspond to electoral victory in the fall. I know some Democrats, though, are concerned that the turnout was somewhat down from the previous election cycle 4 years ago. Part of that is just the federalism effect, right? That Democrats have the White House, they have Congress. And so for many Democratic Party base voters, everything's okay in the world right now. Donald Trump is out of the picture. That was a huge motivating factor 4 years ago that drove Democrats in droves to the polls. And Donald Trump is not a factor. He's not in the game anymore. And so that with that factor gone, there's a little bit less intensity there for the base Democratic Party voters, for many of them. And the fact that the Democrats have the White House and have Congress, I think, gives a sense of assurance to many Democrats that they control the government right now. And they're not as interested, perhaps, in sort of the lower ticket type races that happen in these off election years, as we have in Virginia, than they would be otherwise if there were a Donald Trump-like figure in the picture right now.
My sense of the voter turnout question is that most voters, one, are not primary voters anyway. And they just really wanted the Democratic Party to nominate people that they can vote for in November, people who aren't crazy. And, for those voters, this election was a solid outcome, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's right. You could say it's the grown-up party right now, that the voters were really looking toward who has the best chance of winning an election and holding power, as opposed to who is a statement candidate, who stands for certain issues, who's pure on all of the ideological issues that, in this case, the progressive wing of the party really cares about. You have a strong majority of the primary voters coming out and voting for, I think, what most would say is a more pragmatic choice than going with a liberal activist instead to be the party nominee, to pick somebody who's a well-known party centrist, who has held the office of governor previously, who has the ability to raise and spend large sums of money and to compete with, by the way, a Republican nominee who's going to spend an unprecedented amount of money in this campaign. So although much of the professional literature in my field says that primary voters are not very pragmatic and they tend to go more for ideological statement-type candidates, that is clearly not what happened here in Virginia's primary.
Just to piggyback on Mark's point, I think it's also probably fair to say that Republican convention goers also did not pick the kind of maximally ideological candidate. That probably would have been State Senator Amanda Chase, and she ended up finishing effectively third in the convention. And so I think that both McAuliffe and Youngkin, I wouldn't call either of them really moderate, but I think it's fair to say that the voters in both parties had more ideological options that they decided not to go with. And so they went with kind of what I think of as a mainstream Republican and a mainstream Democrat.
This is a good pivot to talking about the lieutenant governor's race, because that was the best opportunity for progressives or the left wing or whatever you want to call them to get a win statewide. They had all backed Rasul for the most part, and Rasul ended up coming in at 25-ish%, just under. And it wasn't enough to best Ayala, who got some VIP endorsements toward the end of the race. And that ended up pushing her over the top from being a candidate who in the last reporting period wasn't even that viable to now the nominee for lieutenant governor. What do we make of the lieutenant governor race, which had confused a lot of primary voters?
Yeah, so I think both parties actually got their more ideological type candidate in the lieutenant governor nomination. The Republicans, an arch conservative for lieutenant governor, and the Democrats, a strong progressive for lieutenant governor. So for those who are looking for the party to put on the ticket, somebody who is going to appeal to the activist core of the party that tends to be a bit more ideological than the regular rank and file voter in a general election, the lieutenant governor race ended up working out quite well for both of the political parties in this case.
Yeah, Hala is certainly a progressive, that's for sure. Kyle, what did you think?
I think, first of all, it's probably better to, as just from a geographical perspective, to be a Northern Virginia candidate than it is to be from Roanoke, because you saw amongst the two leading candidates, you saw a real kind of geographical split in that Sam Rozell did very well in kind of the western part of the state, and Ayala did really well in the eastern part of the state. It's just a lot more people in the eastern part of the state. I also think that, and I'm stealing this point from the Washington Post, Dave Weigel, he tweeted out, in some ways, the results from the primary were kind of a vindication of outgoing Governor Ralph Northam, who, of course, had a huge problem with the blackface scandal that emerged in early 2019. And he decided to basically just try to weather the storm. And it turned out that his endorsement was, I think, valuable to some candidates. And Ayala is one of those candidates who ended up winning with Northam's endorsement. I think probably for a lot of voters, it was hard to kind of sift through the many choices in the lieutenant governor's race, and maybe the Northam endorsement was helpful to Ayala, and also just having kind of a geographical advantage as being from a more populous part of the state.
One thing that Ayala is going to have to deal with is this money from Dominion. She was one of the many members of the General Assembly to take this pledge that she would not take money from Dominion. Then she went back and ended up taking $100,000 from Dominion, despite having taken this pledge. And so I saw that House Republican leader Todd Gilbert said that she made news in the last days of her campaign for being a liar. How is she going to deal with this? So far, she has done little more than having a written statement about this, which was totally non-responsive. The day that the campaign contributions were public, I was hitting up her campaign staff for a written statement, and they sent one, and it was non-responsive to the question. It didn't explain at all why she took the money. How is she going to deal with this issue on the campaign trail? Kyle, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Mark.
Well, I just don't necessarily know if beyond kind of the activist crowd, if there are going to be a lot of voters who really care about it. I mean, maybe there were primary voters who cared about it, but I think she turned in a pretty impressive performance in a splintered field. And, I think that the attack you just mentioned on her as being, as not being truthful about this is probably a fair one. But on the substance of the matter, is this something that a lot of voters statewide who otherwise would vote for Ayala are going to care about? I just don't necessarily know if that's going to be the case.
I think that says it all, really. It's not an issue that is going to drive voting decisions predominantly in this election cycle. Voters are going to be much more focused on the big pocketbook issues, the state of the economy, education, the environment, healthcare, and the like. And some of this issue just seems a little bit inside baseball to many voters who are not really going to comprehend it fully. So I don't see a lot of political gain there for Republicans to use against her. And also just keep in mind, the vast majority of the voters don't pay a lot of attention to the down ticket races, particularly lieutenant governor, until you get very close to election day itself. in Virginia campaigns. So if this is a typical Virginia election campaign, the down ticket races are probably going to track pretty consistently with how the top of the ticket does, unless the opposition party is capable of differentiating one of those down ticket candidates from the top of the ticket in a way that gets voters to think very seriously about splitting their ballots.
Yeah, just to Mark's point, I wrote something about this in our Crystal Ball newsletter about just looking at the kind of the modern history of statewide elections in Virginia, which goes back to 1969, which is the first year that the Republicans won the governorship since Reconstruction. And, it used to be that you would see, huge differences between how people voted for governor versus attorney general or lieutenant governor. There are certain years where, incumbents can't run for another term in the governor's race, but they can do that for lieutenant governor and for attorney general. And sometimes you see a big incumbency advantage for some of these candidates. But in more recent history, in the 2017 race, the difference among the three statewide races, Northam won by about 9 points. Justin Fairfax was the weakest performing Democrat. He won by about 5.5. Also, in the last three election cycles, the same party has won all three of the statewide races. There is going to be some variation in these races among the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, but you probably would expect them all to vote the same way, unless we're talking about a year in which maybe all the races are really close, and so that the differences among the races might tip one race to one party and the others maybe to the other party. But you're not going to see, I don't think, a dramatic difference in the governor result versus lieutenant governor or attorney general. I don't think.
Yeah, and when it comes to Hala having to answer for breaking a pledge or whatever and taking money from Dominion, one, voters don't like candidates who take pledges because they don't like having their politicians' hands tied. They just look at what the Republicans did with the no tax pledge, and we have to reform taxes. If you want to look at how the Civil War between Dominion and Michael Bills played out, look at Candy King, who reveled. She was doing laps on Twitter, punching Michael Bills over and again, being in your face about taking the Dominion money or being willing to take the Dominion money. And she won 2-1. So if you're an outsider looking in or somebody who's trying to make hay over the Dominion money, it's not going to work because voters don't care, but also because we already have a proven track record. Hala is a national security candidate. Nobody knows where Michael Bills is getting his money from for hedge fund investments. That Blue Stem Asset Management employs 10 people. Dominion employs 17,000 people, and their money is bundled into a employees PAC. It's not all one guy or one family, as is the case with Clean Virginia and Michael Bills' money. So from that perspective, Dominion's going to win the day. The establishment Democrats are going to win the day. And my guess is that nobody's going to be signing pledges in the future.
Right. I agree with you. Pledges are generally bad politics, and they're also, quite frankly, bad leadership. Political leaders should not simply eliminate the ability to maneuver depending upon changing circumstances over time. And what a pledge says to the voters is that the candidate has nailed himself or herself down to an issue position with no flexibility in the future, even if circumstances change. And that's just not leadership. So I just think these pledges are silly, and they're a tactic sometimes to try to nail down an opponent to be able to say something that the person making the pledge wants the other person to make a commitment to. But I rarely have seen it work very well in a political campaign.
Okay, well, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the geographic imbalance to the Democratic ticket, Mark Herring winning the primary for Attorney General, and the 5 House incumbents who were unseated. We're joined by Mark Rozell and Kyle Kondik. We'll be right back.
Introducing a brand new line of Flex power tools exclusively at Lowe's. A top pick for pros on the Lowe's list for innovation, this high-performance power tool line has everything a pro like you needs. Industry-leading battery technology delivering 20% more power, a longer runtime, and faster charging too. Shop in-store or online at Lowe's.com. Lowe's, the new home for pros. Versus National Home Centers for Flex 24-volt. Flex 24-volt batteries compared to 18-volt 20 max batteries utilizing the same cells. U.S. only.
Been thinking about McDonald's all day. Can't get it off my mind. I can already taste it. Ooh, got my mind on my mouth and my mouth ready for some Mickey D's deal.
There's a deal for every moment at McDonald's.
Right now, get 2 of your favorites for just $3.50. Mix and match a classic McChicken, a hot and spicy McChicken, or a juicy McDouble. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with combo meal. Single item at regular price.
Hey, you. Yes, you. You're listening to Transition Virginia right now, and you're probably a fan of the podcast, right? Well, then rate and review, like Trevor Sutherland.
1 star. The only time I listen is when I'm on.
That's not really what I was thinking. Well, how about this review from Richard Krause?
This piece of shit podcast, I wouldn't even rate 1 star.
Come on, listeners. I know you can do better than that. Hit the pause button right now and give us a quick review. And we're back on Transition Virginia. We're talking about the Democratic primary. And there's one outcome of this election that might cause some trouble for Democrats. All 3 of the Democrats elected statewide are from Northern Virginia. There's no geographic balance at all on the ticket. Meanwhile, the Republicans are boasting they have the most diverse ticket in Virginia history. Kyle Kondik, is that lack of geographic diversity going to be a problem for Democrats in this election cycle?
I think that probably where a candidate is from probably matters a little bit less now than it did maybe a few decades ago, just because I think people's partisanship is sort of harder baked in. And I don't know if in general elections you're going to see as much of that kind of maybe like regional pride. I will say maybe it matters slightly on the margins. All 3 of the Republican candidates have at least some connection to the Hampton Roads area. Glenn Youngkin spent a little time as a teenager in Tidewater. Winsome Sears, while she lives in Winchester now, when she was served her term in the State House of Delegates, her district was covered part of Hampton Roads, and Jason Mier is the Attorney General candidate. His district represents part of Virginia Beach. And look, if the Republicans are going to win statewide, they need to do way better in Hampton Roads than Donald Trump did in 2020. Specifically, the cities of Chesapeake and Virginia Beach voted for Trump in 2016. They flipped to Biden in 2020. At the very least, the Republican ticket needs to win those places, and not just by a few points. And look, if there's a little bit of a home field advantage that the ticket gets in Hampton Roads, that's potentially helpful. Obviously for Northern Virginia, that is the engine now for Democratic statewide victories. But also, I don't know if people in Northern Virginia feel any sort of, regional pride about having regional candidates. I mean, there's so many transplants who live in Northern Virginia in particular in the state that again, I don't think it matters. So I agree with you that the regional thing is going to come up and that it's a Northern Virginia heavy ticket for Democrats. I don't necessarily know if it matters all that much.
Yeah, I think Kyle has it right. Regionalism is not as important as it used to be. There's not a lot of Virginians who are saying, wow, I'm going to vote for, my regional candidate here. And because of the polarization of the electorate, which has just taken hold so strongly, having an all Northern Virginia ticket, if regional identity means anything at all, well, that's a great place to be from, because that's where the votes are these days. If you look at the electoral map of Virginia and where the votes are coming from, it's quite remarkable, the heavy concentration in the Northern Virginia suburbs and along the urban corridor, which is, of course, why the Republicans are so challenged right now to win statewide in trying to appeal to the suburbs. More than anything, the election's going to come down to the suburban regions of the state throughout.
Yeah, I actually think it's a good thing that Northern Virginia is finally in charge of the ticket, because that's where the center of gravity is politically, and it has been there for quite some time. Fairfax County, for example, has 30 members of the House of Delegates alone. So it makes more sense that Northern Virginia should be getting more representation. And then the other thing to consider is that Northern Virginia and its voters care a lot about national security. And right now, unfortunately, the Republican Party is a threat to national security, and the FBI is going to have to figure out why, but it is what it is. And so it's good to have Northern Virginia in the driver's seat finally.
On the issue of law and order, this is something that Republicans are putting at the center of their campaign. They're the party of law and order. And, this is particularly important for the attorney general race, where I think we're going to see Jason Miyares say that he's running on a platform of keeping the streets safe and the criminals behind bars, and attacking Attorney General Herring for the criminal justice reform efforts, for legalizing marijuana, for all of the things that he's done as Attorney General. What do we make of this dynamic here between the law and order party versus the criminal justice reform party in the Attorney General race? Mark Rozell, I'll start with you.
The Republicans are counting on, they believe, the Democrats having lurched too far to the political left on a variety of issues, particularly in the area of criminal justice reform. And if there is at all an upswing, for example, in criminal activity that is documented, the Republicans certainly will make a lot of that in this campaign, and suggesting that under Democratic Party leadership, taking away the focus from law and order type issues has made people in their suburban homes, for example, a lot less safe than they would be under a Republican administration. So you can understand that's going to be a major appeal by the Republicans in this election cycle. But a lot of that's going to come down to really what happens over the next several months, not only in Virginia, but nationally on these issues, because so much of the framework that voters are operating under is really a part of a national political discussion, not a state, local, regional one. And how these issues play out on the national stage, I think, are going to have a big impact in how they work for each of the parties in this election cycle this year in Virginia.
There's a lot to unpack here, and I think Mark's right that sort of the reality on the ground is going to matter, and how people feel about issues of public safety. I think there's probably I think there are probably a lot of voters who maybe look at both parties and say, I think immigration is kind of a related issue to this kind of larger kind of law and order, so-called law and order umbrella. And they probably look at the Trump Republican Party and say, on issues of immigration or on issues of so-called law and order, that maybe the Republicans are kind of too hard on those sorts of issues. And then maybe they'll look at the Democrats and say, well, hey, maybe the Democrats are too soft. There is a long history of the presidential party in a Virginia gubernatorial setting performing worse in the gubernatorial race than the party did in the presidential race that happens a year before the governor's race. That's a pretty common trend. The presidential party often loses the Virginia governorship, although one modern exception, of course, is that Terry McAuliffe himself bucked that trend in 2013. He won even though Barack Obama was in the White House and actually was not very popular in November of 2013. But one of the things that I think helps explain why the president's party often struggles, not just in the Virginia gubernatorial race, but also more broadly in midterm elections. We'll have the midterm coming up in 2022 in Virginia and across the country, is that, public opinion sometimes changes when there's a presidential administration change, and that there's a kind of a fancy political science term for this called thermostatic public opinion, which is that basically that when there's a liberal administration in the White House, the public maybe starts to voice more conservative opinions on things, and vice versa. If there's a conservative administration, the public maybe expresses a little bit more liberal opinions on things. And so the question then becomes, does the public get a little more conservative, a little bit more open to Republicans? Are there problems in Virginia or in Democratic-controlled Washington that turn some people against the Democratic Party? Those are all things that are important for this election. And I think, frankly, that, Youngkin and the Republicans Republican ticket need a little bit of help from circumstances. If they need the Democrats to make some mistakes, they need some issues to pop up that are helpful to Republicans and maybe hurtful to Democrats. Certainly when Ed Gillespie ran for governor in 2017, he focused a lot on, he was running ads about gang activity and MS-13 and other things. And it just kind of fell flat in the environment of 2017. But maybe that sort of messaging won't fall flat for various reasons in 2021, although it's also not guaranteed to work.
Yeah, the more Republicans want to talk about law and order and the more they use dog whistles to talk about it, the less votes they're going to win, especially in the suburbs.
I think, and I think the gubernatorial nominee largely understands that for the Republicans right now, Glenn Youngkin, although he made overtures to the Trump wing of the Republican Party in order to get the nomination. And Terry McAuliffe will never let that be forgotten in this election campaign. Youngkin has certainly tried to pivot toward a more mainstream conservative message for the purpose of the general election campaign. So in the pre-Trump era, they always said to the Republicans, run right to get the nomination, move toward the middle to win the general election. It's not so easy these days because how do you run with Trump and then kind of disown him after getting the nomination, because you risk losing a lot of those core Trump voters who the nominee needs in order to win the election. So I think Youngkin has a very big challenge ahead of him as the nominee of the Republican Party. He wants to get away, I believe, from the Trump faction to the extent that he can hold their votes without continually making overtures to them on issues that most appeal to those voters. And he wants to expand his base of support by reaching out to more mainstream conservatives and moderate Republicans and moderate to conservative Democrats as well. The big question is, will he be able to do that effectively? I think it's going to be very difficult to do.
The other thing that Youngkin's got going for him, or against him, I should say, is that he fed into the big lie.
Yep.
And he called into question the results of the election, which were unquestionable. And by doing that, he committed sedition. He played with people who were trying to cause insurrection at the Capitol. And so therefore, Virginia being the home of Langley, the home of Dulles National Airport, the home of Quantico, the home of countless three-letter agencies that do and don't exist, the Republican Party is a national security risk. And it's just that simple. You don't need to know anything else about the politics or the positions that they've got.
Okay, so here's the challenge, right? Youngkin tried to nuance it by saying he was concerned about election integrity, right? Which is different than, strictly speaking, saying that he believes that Joe Biden is not the legitimately elected president of the United States. Clearly, I think he made a big mistake in not earlier acknowledging the legitimacy of the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. And he made his pivot, of course, after having won the Republican nomination and openly acknowledge that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. Story over. And again, that's the challenge for Youngkin, right? That he needed to do and say certain things to get the nomination in order to have a chance to become governor. And I think he compromised on a lot of things in order to do that, which he would not certainly be the first candidate running for a party nomination to do that, right? But it's a lot harder to pivot from reaching out to the Trump faction and then moving away from it than it is to run right and then run center by nuancing differences of policy issues. So I think you're right. He's got a big challenge ahead of him in order to be credible to mainstream voters that he's not simply a Trump acolyte. And that some of the things he said, well, that was just to get the nomination, but wink, wink, nod, nod. Here's what he really thinks.
I mentioned Hampton Roads earlier as being really electorally important, and I really thought that if you look at the 2020 results, that Democrats really did. I was sort of surprised at how well they did at Hampton Roads. Flipping Virginia Beach, flipping Chesapeake from Trump had won it in 2016, and of course, Hampton Roads is a pretty military heavy area, and I think you could sort of infer that however well Donald Trump did with, the combination of military personnel and veterans in 2016, that he probably did worse in 2020. And, those are folks that, Youngkin is going to have to win back, and the Republican ticket is going to have to win back. And there may be ways that they can do that, but if in fact there's still some sort of lingering problem with those kinds of voters for the Republican ticket, that's potentially still a problem in 2021. And the House of Delegates. There are a number of competitive races across the map, but a lot of people feel like Hampton Roads is not just important for the statewides, but there are also some districts in that part of the state that are really important for majority control of the House of Delegates this year.
One issue that we're going to hear Republicans talk about this election cycle is the politics of the past. I think Tommy Norman probably put this the best when he said Democrats have taken their enthusiasm for recycling to the extreme, recycling 2/3 of the 2013 ticket. Mark Rozell, is this going to be a problem for Democrats that they've got candidates who are the politics of the past? That's the argument Republicans are going to make. Is that going to stick?
For the voters who believe that experience matters, it's not a problem, clearly. Having an incumbent and a previous occupier of the governor's mansion showcases that the Democratic Party ticket has a great deal of governing experience. Put that up against the Republican ticket, of course, which is led by a gubernatorial nominee who has never held elective office before. So there's a good case there for Democratic Party voters and Democratic Party leaning voters to argue that they have the superior ticket based on experience. But for those who are looking for change, who believe that the Democratic Party needs to move in a different direction, and all these old white guys coming back, well, maybe there is a lack of enthusiasm there, and that's part of the turnout problem that Kyle was talking about before that might exist on the Democratic Party side, given that the turnout was down a bit this time from where it was 4 years ago. Maybe that somewhat suggests that the intensity factor among the base of the Democratic Party is not quite there as much as it was 4 years ago, when everybody just wanted to send a message to the electorate regarding Donald Trump as president of the United States. They had something to vote against in that campaign. They're not going to have that this time around.
Yeah, I think it's if in fact the Republicans do well in November, it may be in part because this Democratic ticket doesn't gin up the kind of enthusiasm, particularly in a world where Donald Trump is no longer the occupant of the White House, although he continues to be very much a public figure, more so than previous former presidents have been public figures. And look, I think McAuliffe recognizes that keeping Trump front of mind is an important motivational tool. I mean, he was supposedly he was on MSNBC, soon after winning the nomination, and basically challenged Donald Trump to come to Virginia. And of course, McAuliffe wants Trump to come to Virginia because he wants to remind voters that Trump supports Glenn Youngkin and whatnot. And this is a race in which I think during the Obama years we kind of got used to Republicans trying to nationalize races in Virginia in years like 2013 and 2014, when Democrats were held to pretty close to competitive statewide margins, and Democrats were trying to figure out their own identities and try to localize the races. This time it's the Republicans who are going to be trying to localize, and Democrats are the ones trying to nationalize. And I think that speaks to one, it speaks to Trump and how poorly he did in Virginia relative to past Republican presidential candidates. But I think it also speaks to how Virginia is sort of on the road to becoming more and more of a clearly Democratic state, as opposed to used to being a red state at the federal level and then was sort of a swing state for a little while. And really, this governor's race will help kind of confirm whether Virginia still is a swing state or whether it's become kind of more of a safely Democratic state.
Okay, well, we're running out of time. So real quick, we need to talk about the House of Delegates and all the incumbents who lost. Kyle, this is something that you've been paying close attention to. What do you have to tell us and our listeners on this issue?
So yeah, you did have 5 incumbents lose primaries, which is a relatively high number, historically speaking. More incumbents lost than in the past several primary years in Virginia. You had one Republican lose, Charles Poindexter, who basically was primaried from the right, which is an easy story and a familiar story in the Republican Party. And then you had 4 Democrats lose. two of whom ended up losing. One of them, in fact, was Lee Carter, who also ran for governor and didn't do particularly well, ended up losing his primary as well. He was basically tweeting about how he was it seems like he was kind of happy to leave, and happy to be out of politics. But Carter is a self-described socialist. He was probably the most liberal or progressive member of the House of Delegates, and so he lost to a less liberal challenger. That also happened in another race. But then you also had two instances of members losing to candidates who kind of ran to their left. So it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of the overall fight for control of the House of Delegates. Democrats have a 55-45 advantage right now in the House of Delegates. I don't necessarily know if the primary really changed all that much. I think that Democrats are probably in better shape to win the majority, but it seems like there's a world in which, Youngkin comes close but doesn't win the governorship, but that there are enough voters who split their tickets that, maybe Republicans could win a narrow majority in the House of Delegates, even if Democrats maintain control of the statewide executive offices. And, this is just maybe the first part of a three-part story, in that because the redistricting was delayed, and the data that's needed from the census to do redistricting, it seems likely that Virginia is going to have House of Delegates races in 2021. Then we're going to have a new map drawn in 2022. And so sort of a special round of House Delegates races in 2022, and then another regular election on the new map in 2023. So whatever happens in the House of Delegates, we could be right back at it in 2022.
Yeah, let me make one last point here. I think that was a great way to pull it all together. You had several candidates who ran simultaneously for different offices, right, who held state legislative seats but were running for a statewide nomination and ended up losing both. Let that be a lesson. It sure sends a signal to the voters within a legislative district that the incumbent really doesn't care about that position quite so much, would rather have a higher position and is using it to leverage an opportunity for a higher level office. Well, guess what happened? They ended up losing both.
So that's all for this episode.
Support us on Patreon or send us an email to transitionvapodcast@gmail.com.
Like and follow at TransitionVA on Twitter and anywhere pods are cast.
Read the transcripts at transitionvirginia.com, and special thanks to Emily Cottrell for figuring out what the heck we're saying.
Thanks for being on the transition team. We're your hosts, Thomas Bowman.
And I'm Michael Pope.
2021 is the 25th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the last comprehensive update to Internet regulation. The Internet has experienced more than a few updates since 1996, but Internet regulations have not. That's why Facebook supports updated regulations on key issues like preventing election interference, protecting people's privacy, reforming Section 230, and more. See Facebook's progress on key issues and what's next at about.fb.com/regulations.
I think what flavor of these new Dunkin' Coconut Refreshers you get says a lot about you.
Really? What's it say about me?
Well, you got the refreshing golden peach because you're vibrant, fun, and positive.
Oh, what about me?
The bold purple pomegranate means you're vibrant, fun, and positive.
I take it I got this delicious pink strawberry because I'm vibrant, fun, and positive.
Yeah, it's a simple system, really.
Share the shine. Enjoy a medium Dunkin' Coconut Refresher for $3. Order ahead plus earn rewards. America runs on Dunkin'. Participation may vary. Limited time offer. Excludes classic Dunkin' Refreshers.